This conference will now be recorded.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our fourth episode of Preservation Conversations. We're so glad you could join us again today, our fourth straight week of doing this. I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe and healthy on this very sunny Wednesday morning. So just a couple of, just a few reminders. If you've been with us on a previous call or seen us on YouTube, just a couple of housekeeping reminders for this. We ask that you please mute your phones. It just helps cut down on any background noise. I know you guys don't really want to hear the homeschooling that's going on in my dining room right now. So please mute your phones. Throughout the course of the next hour, if you do have a question, we encourage you to send it via the chat feature. It looks like a little conversation bubble, and you can just type your question in there, and we will keep track of that for when we get to our live Q&A segment towards the end of our little conversation. And as you probably heard, this is going to be recorded and posted to our YouTube and website later on today or tomorrow. So we'll have it for future reference, and anyone who you can go ahead and watch it again later, or other people who weren't able to join us will be able to watch it. So going backwards. So just again, this is just a kind of an informal way to positively connect, communicate, and share. It's been great for the past 4 weeks to see the different people joining us and asking questions about preservation. In general, we've had a couple of discussion topics for the past few weeks, but again, if you have a question that doesn't even relate to what we've talked about today, that's completely fine. We encourage you to ask your questions. If for some reason we get a lot of questions and we're not able to answer all of them within the hour, please feel free to email the question to either myself or to Chris Skelly from MHC, who's also on this conversation. Our emails will be at the end. We encourage you to please email us your question, and we'll do our best to get back to you and answer your question. So, okay. So today's topic of conversation, I'll just put the right agenda in front of me, came out of, again, it's kind of a little organic growth out of last week's conversation about growing local capacity and grassroots. So we thought we would talk about today threatened historic buildings and historic resources and what to do. And this is probably one of the most common questions that we at Preservation Massachusetts get, and I know Chris at MHC gets this call a lot. We'll get calls from local advocates or organizations who are concerned about threats to a historic building in their community, and they want to know what they can do about it. So we're going to try to delve in a little bit today to help kind of peel back some of the layers and talk about what you as local advocates need in terms of information, community support, resources, and planning. But I think one of the most important things to think about, and I know all of the participants on our call today will really echo this, is if you're concerned about a building, there is really no white knight in shining armor that's going to come and save the historic building. It's really you. You have the most ability and the most, it's really, you have the most power, so to speak, when it comes to saving a local historic building or area that you feel is threatened. So it's really you, the local advocate, really have the most standing and the most, the most ability, to actually see something done. Probably had too many cups of coffee this morning. So once again, on our call today, we have our wonderful Preservation Massachusetts Circuit Riders, Jeff and Stacia, also joined by PM's President Jim Igoe, Program Assistant Nick Moore, and Mass Historical Commission's Chris Skelly, and I am Erin Kelly, Associate Director of Preservation Massachusetts. So I'll keep going backwards. So moving on. So what does it mean to be threatened? Threat's a pretty general word, but when we think of threats to historic buildings, there are some certain categories and certain things that that kind of immediately jump to mind when we think of things that could really impact historic buildings and historic resources out there. They include outright demolition. They include development that can be excuse me, inappropriate development, incorporating a historic building into a development in a way that's not necessarily sensitive, inappropriate rehabilitation, vacancy, neglect, demolition by neglect. You have a building that's just sitting there. There's no active use for it, no plans for its future. And then another big one is there's no money to do anything with it. So it's just going to sit there. So threats can be, and it doesn't just have to be these, threats can come in for a variety of ways. Some of them are obviously more apparent than others, but these are just some general ideas, and I think all of us know what it means to be threatened or know a threatened historic resource when we see one. So a building in your community is threatened. That let's say there's a demolition permit was pulled for it, or there's the property recently changed hands and the new owner hasn't expressed any sort of interest in rehabilitating or reusing a historic building. It can be overwhelming, and it's extremely emotional, especially a lot of threatened resources often are community landmarks. They've been part of the community fabric for a long time. And it can be very, very emotional when you think about these important parts of our community no longer being there. And really, as local advocates, when it is emotional, we can oftentimes get very, very charged up and very, be very, 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 very passionate. But one of the most important things is you obviously, in trying to figure out what's the next step, you need information and you need resources, support, and a plan. And because this is one of the most common queries that we get both at Preservation Mass, and as I said, I know Chris said he gets these questions a lot. Similar to our local advocate conversation last week, Chris also has a 15 questions to consider when you're dealing with a threatened resource. So I'm going to turn this over to Chris, and he's going to walk through the 15 questions to consider when dealing with threatened historic resources, and how he interacts with them and how he deals with them with his capacity at MHC. So Chris, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, thanks, Erin, and good morning, everyone. And I think what I'll do is maybe if people could start to ask questions in the chat. I kind of like to see the questions coming in, so we have some sense of what you're wondering about. So Erin has the 15 questions up on the screen already. So I'm going to go through these. I kind of like the word 15 seems to work well. So last week we had preservation advocates, 15 ideas for preservation advocates, and I came up with this one a couple of years ago. 15 questions to consider when a historic resource is threatened. So I think Erin's going to send this all out later. But basically, I put these together because I do get a lot of questions coming in from either local historical commissions or the general public, wondering what they should do, but also kind of having some sense of confusion over how processes work. So a lot of people think that calling the State Historic Preservation Office is going to be able to save that building somehow, and I have to be the bearer of that bad news that no, our office typically almost can never save a historic resource, that it really is done at the local level. So yes, I have actually even had somebody say to me, well, I thought when we called your office, a knight in shining armor would come down and save this building, and it's like, no, there's no preservation prince that comes down and saves anything for you. I'm flattered that you think I have that kind of power, but I don't have that kind of power. So it all comes down to really local techniques for saving historic resources. And what I did on the 15 questions, just before I start the 15 questions, on what Erin will send out, I do have a paragraph right up at front that says our office has no authority, almost always, to require the protection of historic resources. Protection of historic resources lies almost exclusively at the local level through local government action, local nonprofit organizations, and citizen advocacy. Okay, so then the first question is the Historical Commission already aware of this? So I put that in because I get lots of calls that come in from the general public, and I really want to direct them back to their local Historical Commission first. So if that's already been done, then it's on to the next steps. Are there local bylaws or ordinances that could delay, protect, or otherwise protect, provide an alternative to demolition? So demolition delay, maybe a local historic district, an architectural preservation district, looking at all those kinds of local regulatory processes that might help to protect historic resources. If those aren't in place, then there isn't as many things that you can do, but it certainly doesn't mean you have nothing in terms of resources available to you. There's still really a lot of things you can do, even if you don't have the strength of a local historic district in place already. Lots of times I get this, the third one is, has the local historical commission taken a formal position on this? And I put that in because lots of commissions call our office wanting us to write a letter expressing concern about the demolition of a building. And I often say, well, that's really going to be best if the local historical commission actually does that. Have the local historical commission, you as the local historical commission, if you're on the historical commission, should meet, should deliberate this. And even if you don't have demolition delay, having some kind of a letter on your letterhead of the local historical commission is going to be effective in some way, even if that doesn't necessarily have, again, a regulatory piece with it. It's really good to have that formal aspect there, that the local historical commission has taken a position here. All right, and then I'm a big believer in we talked about this last week a little bit, the idea of having a local friends group or a nonprofit organization, some organization besides the local historical commission that can advocate and really get a message out in ways that a 3 to 7 member local historical commission is not well equipped to do. So we have a number of nonprofit advocacy organizations, local nonprofit advocacy organizations in Massachusetts, in Salem or New Bedford, Springfield, Falmouth, Dartmouth, in Boston. But it'd certainly be great to see a lot more of those out there. And I think they're really effective because you have that ability to have a lot more members and a lot more people speaking up, a lot more people informed of what's happening that way. All right, and then the next 3 questions, 5, 6, and 7, all relate to either an inventory form or the National Register. Now, the main thing to get across there is that none of those things are really going to be effective at protecting a resource. So sometimes we get that call that says, we need to get this on the National Register as soon as possible because it's going to be demolished. And then I have to explain that National Register really is an honorary designation, but that it can be useful in these cases, again, because of advocacy, the ability to say, this is put on the nation's list. It's clearly recognized by the federal government as a significant resource, and that can really, really help with local advocacy efforts. For the inventory forms, we would like to be able to say that the inventory forms are not a statement of significance, but it is great when things are on an inventory form just to have really good information at hand. So you know the history of a property, especially if your inventory form is pretty up to date. You can just quickly look in your files or on our website and go, okay, that's the date of construction, that's the architectural style here, that's who the families or the uses that this building had over time. All those things can really tell a story and can really, again, help sort of personalize it when you're describing that resource in terms of why it's an important part of your local community. So number 8's about our state and federal involvement in projects. So our office does have limited review when there's a state or federal involvement in a project, but it is very limited, and it's really not the strongest method of protecting historic resources. But if you do believe that there's some sort of federal or state involvement in a project in terms of funding, licensings, or permits, that would be something that the local historical commission may want to talk to our office about. All right, and the number one, or I'd say the most important piece here is number 9, which is there a grassroots effort to advocate for this historic property? So I'm going to read this one out in its entirety. Just saving a threatened historic resource cannot be accomplished by just one person or by just the local historical commission. A grassroots advocacy campaign is essential. Grassroots advocacy is perhaps the most overlooked historic preservation tool, and it may be the most effective. So again, I'd say the idea of having a lot of people, we kind of like what we talked about last week, about having lots of advocates, having just that grassroots constituency that's ready to speak up, ready to voice their concerns. All that is really, really important, and probably the most effective method of doing historic preservation. 10 is just looking to see, is there other local permits? Do they need to go to the Zoning Board of Appeals? How are all those local processes going to work in terms of ZBA, Planning Board, Conservation Commission? 11 about using media. 12, another really important one here about contacting a circuit rider at Preservation Massachusetts. So the circuit riders, Stacia and Jeff, may have some other ideas in terms of strategies to think about. One technique I would imagine they would recommend would be thinking about Preservation Massachusetts' most endangered resources list. And then thinking about your local politicians and how that once you've got that grassroots constituency, once you've got a good amount of people together that are ready to speak up, that's when you talk to your local politicians about your concerns. So citizens, residents, neighborhood groups all should be writing, calling their city council, select board members to express their concerns. 14, just about being civil, positive. Sometimes these local matters can get a little personal, little derogatory at times. So important to maintain your civility, respect others, seek out the positives whenever you can. Some of the things that we talked about last week as well. And then number 15, what to do if you're not successful, because that may happen as well, is to just think about that this isn't the best way to be doing historic preservation, trying to doing it at the last minute like this when something's imminently threatened. It's really good to be thinking about long-term strategies, planning, community-wide historic preservation planning is kind of one of the messages that I always try to get across. And that strategy in the long term is going to be far more successful. So sometimes that demolition is just the catalyst to get things going. And if you've got your grassroots constituency at that point, try to think about ways that you can hang on to that constituency and really, really keep things going from then on. And I think that's really the best approach. All right, that's it.
Thank you very much, Chris. And yes, we will be sharing these great 15 questions to consider. And if you weren't on the call with us last week, we had a great conversation about growing grassroots local capacity and grassroots advocacy. It's available on the PM website, and Chris had another great 15 questions to consider there. So a lot of what we're talking about is intertwined, but but if you haven't had a chance, go back and take a look at that. That could also be helpful to you too. We have a bunch of questions that have already come in. So I'll take a couple. We'll pop a couple questions in now before we kind of turn things over to Jeff and Stacia and some PM input. But anybody, so Jeff, Stacia, Chris, anybody chime in for some of these questions. So the first question that came in was, experience dealing with real estate brokers. A local experience lately has been that realtors are recommending demolitions for tear down sale of properties for new construction, something we hear about a lot. So any thoughts or input? Jeff, Stacia, Chris, any thoughts about the experience dealing with real estate brokers?
Well, this is Jeff. I think this is a question in a situation that comes up a lot, and it is a challenge because if you think about it, real estate brokers are on the front lines of changes in historic properties more so than anyone else, and often a lot of the fate of some of these properties can be in their hands. And if you have a particularly enlightened broker who is sensitive to the historic value of the properties that they're working with, that's great. If you don't, as this question seems to indicate that the properties end up being marketed as kind of tear downs or development sites, then that's the opposite end of the spectrum. And in speaking about this topic before, one of the things that we've talked about is the sort of fiduciary responsibility that brokers have and to their clients if they're selling their property. And it's a tricky dynamic, and ultimately what happens to the property beyond the transaction either isn't in their control or not part of their concern. They're concerned with making the transaction happen, and that's tricky. We have seen examples of really excellent brokers. I can think of one on Cape Cod in particular, who has made it her role to specialize in marketing historic properties and has developed a whole website about architectural styles, and really has mounted a kind of mini education campaign to educate the people who come to her to sell the properties, but also potential buyers about the value of preserving historic homes, in particular, how these homes are often more valuable than other homes, just really putting out good information about why preserving the structure rather than tearing it down is a good idea. And Stacia, I know you come across this too, and you've been involved in those conversations. Is there anything you can add from your perspective?
I think another thing that I would point to as a great model, which is not going to help necessarily in the situation that the person posing the question may be in, but I know that there are some local nonprofit, historic preservation nonprofit organizations like Preservation Worcester who have in the past run programs that are targeted towards providing information to local realtors. And so I guess I would encourage, within communities, if you do have a local nonprofit, see if you can work with them to come up with some kind of even brief program that can talk about historic properties and make that available to local realtors in the area.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I recall that Whale in New Bedford had a great program some years ago where they had, since real estate brokers have to complete a certain number of professional education hours to keep their license, I believe, Whale had a program where they would have a half-day session educating people about historic architectural styles and the values of preservation. And by participating in that, you could become a sort of, you got a little, I guess a certificate, but also you could cite this qualification as being certified to market historic properties in the city, which was interesting. It's like adding a certification or qualification to your services by the fact that you attended this training program. So I thought that was a creative way to educate the brokers and also helpfully, encourage them to market their properties from a preservation standpoint rather than a redevelopment or tear down standpoint.
Erin, this is Jim.
Hi, Jim. Go ahead.
To kind of reiterate what Stacia said. When I was the director of preservation in Worcester, we did go to the Worcester Board of Realtors and suggested that they might invite us to come and talk a little bit about what a National Register property was, what a local historic district was, the significance of being an historic property. And I think realtors every 2 years have to take, I think, 12 hours of instruction. So there's opportunities with various boards of realtors across the state to try to get yourself engaged and become involved. And to reiterate what Jeff said, I know New Bedford back, even when Tony Sousa was there, took a lot of pride in working with realtors. And this is so much about educating realtors. You know, as you said, a lot of times they're about their commission. They're not thinking an awful lot about other things. But I know when I purchased the house I'm living in now, it's in a local historic district. Never once did the realtor talk about the fact that it was in a local historic district. I knew it was, but I think for somebody who's blindsided, it could be difficult and very disastrous. So my 2 cents.
Thanks, Jim. I think it really does come down to, it really is about just about education. I think, you know, educating people about what historic preservation is, you know, why our historic buildings are important to our communities. There's a lot of misinformation or misunderstanding about historic preservation that's out there. And I think, you know, just coming down to basic education. And if you're feeling like, oh, I can't create this program, I have no clue where to start, try reaching out and seeing if somebody else has developed something similar. I know the whale program hasn't been in place for a while, but Preservation Worcester's wasn't all that long ago. But go on to the Massachusetts Historic Preservation listserv and ask if anybody has examples of programs. Have they done this before? More oftentimes than not, you're going to find people that are willing to share what they did, how they did it. And so you're not having to recreate the wheel or start from scratch. And if you're still concerned or don't really know where to go, reaching out to Preservation Massachusetts is another good place to start. So we did have another question. Somebody asked what our circuit riders, who our circuit riders are and what they do. So I'll just quickly answer that because I think Jeff and Stacia are going to talk a little bit more in this next section. So our Preservation Massachusetts circuit riders are our two staff people, Jeff and Stacia, and what their role is with Preservation Massachusetts is really is working directly with local advocates, local communities and organizations in a variety of different ways, but really helping to be a mentor, be a guide, be a resource for local preservation projects, challenges, issues, questions, pretty much a whole range of things. Jeff and Stacia both deal with 2 different sides of the state. We kind of divide the state in half along right through Worcester. Jeff is our Eastern Massachusetts circuit rider. Stacia is our Western and Central Massachusetts circuit rider. Because we get a lot of calls and questions. Can you come out? Can you look at this community? Can you look at this building? Can you come to a meeting? And we're a really small staff. We're only 2 full-time, 3 part-time people. So it's and Massachusetts may not seem big, but there's a lot in there. And so the circuit riders, they don't work in the office, they work out of their homes. So they kind of travel all around the state and work directly with communities. And this next section, which we're talking about how Preservation Massachusetts deals with, outreach regarding threatened historic properties. Jeff and Stacia can give you a better sense of how they work with communities and individuals who contact us with their concerns about threatened historic resources. So I'll just kind of pop it back over to Jeff or Stacia. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you deal with threatened resources with Preservation Mass?
Oops, sorry. Sure, this is Jeff again. First of all, everyone, I recognize some names who are participating in the call today from consulting with you about various things in your community, so welcome to this call. We're a little disappointed that because of the situation, we haven't been able to make site visits for the last several weeks, but we hope to continue to do that and to get back to visiting you in person when the time has come. However, these sessions have generated a lot of emails and phone calls to us, which is great. And I was emailing with Stacia this morning about my long list of new things that have come in. So that's terrific. I think that Preservation Mass's ability to keep things moving, especially in a group forum like this, is really great. And what it proves is that even though we're all sort of hunkered down, these issues aren't going away, and I appreciate the folks who have reached out, and I know that Stacia too is probably working hard to get back to everyone who's asked a question. So, but just one quick thing, I think that Chris Skelly's take on this is really valuable, and unfortunately, as we've mentioned in the past, a lot of times these cases come before us at the sort of very last minute, and it's really a struggle to respond in a timely way that's going to help result in a positive outcome. And Chris's last point about his point number 15 about moving forward and learning, I think that particularly in cases where there wasn't a good outcome, that I try to encourage people to use that as a catalyst to lay the groundwork for the next time this situation comes up. So, to learn from why the efforts, even if they were pulled together successfully in the end at the last minute, were not enough to save the property. And, is that because the historical commission in town isn't functioning as well as you might like it, or isn't fully staffed with commissioners? Chris's advocacy for setting up local advocacy organizations, did the loss or the unsuccessful situation expose the need for ongoing efforts from an advocacy level to be formalized in your town or city? I think, to the extent that everyone can try to become more proactive instead of reactive, we're always trying to advocate for that. And I'm sure Stacia has similar experience from her part of the state too, where even though the outcome was not great, it resulted in positive groundwork being laid for the next time a situation arose.
I think to sort of, this is Stacia, to add to what Jeff is mentioning. I think reaching out to Preservation Massachusetts and to Chris at the Massachusetts Historical Commission is always a great idea, because we really, between all of us, see a lot of what's happening all across the state. And many times you may or may not realize that what's happening within your community has happened in other communities. And that one of the things I always am happy to be able to share are some of the models of ways we've seen things happen and may have moved things towards success. And I think that that can always be really beneficial, because I will, echo what Jeff was saying, that and unfortunately there is no magic formula that guarantees success every time. You can do X, Y, and Z. We can tell you to do X, Y, and Z, and you can do everything right and still lose a building. But I always encourage people to never underestimate the power of public opinion to change that outcome. I've seen communities where public opinion has changed an outcome that we thought a building was heading towards demolition, and now it's being renovated. Yes, when a building is lost, there will be a period of mourning, and that's absolutely normal. But echoing what Jeff had said, finding the silver lining, in some communities, a loss or an almost loss has led to the adoption of a demo delay bylaw that may buy time for future buildings, for the exploration of possible solutions. Some of the models that I point to is a community here in Western Massachusetts where we were contacted by a local advocate. A builder had purchased a piece of property that was several acres, had a historic building on it. When we were contacted, the builder was in the process of clearing stone walls, cutting trees, and had received approval to have the building lot divided into multiple lots. And it was someone who builds new houses. After contacting Preservation Massachusetts, us working with a local advocate, he being able to mobilize folks in town, things were able to be turned around, and the local builder decided that he really wanted to continue to build houses, new houses in the area, and that it really wasn't in his best interest to move forward with his initial plans. And so he was willing to sell the property to a preservation-minded person, an owner, and that is a success story, and one that may or may not have gone in that direction without the power of public opinion.
Thank you, Stacia. I was actually just thinking of that example as we were talking a little bit earlier. But I know one of the hardest things to do is to tell people to really, if it doesn't go the way we all want, is to look for that silver lining. And we end up doing a lot of therapy as PM, especially if things don't go the way that people want. But trying to find that silver lining is always an important takeaway. So sorry, I think I interrupted you. You were going to say something.
I think some of the things that I like to share with people, as far as things that that can work, that I've seen work, certainly, as Chris said, we're connecting with the local historical commission, and if there's a local historical society and a local nonprofit, get the word out, create a local friends group, have a Facebook page, an online petition, get coverage in the local news, do a letter to the editor. Reaching out, if you are that local advocate or that local historical commission, reaching out to a local preservation nonprofit or the statewide nonprofit Preservation Massachusetts, to ask for a support letter that can be sent to local leaders who involved in the decision making, working with a planning board to encourage the creation and adoption of zoning that encourages preservation of historic structures. I believe that Hopkinton has this type of bylaw, and it allows developers who've purchased a parcel that has a historic building, that if they agree to preserve the historic structure, that they may be able to have smaller lot sizes. Certainly getting in contact with Hopkinton and learning more about that. But it's a creative way to ensure that it is recognized that development may need to happen, but if a historic structure is preserved, that is a benefit to the community. And in a lot of ways, it's similar to developers who may be required to set aside conservation land as part of a large-scale development. In some communities, creating a local historic district can prevent the demolition and allow time. I know in Springfield at the Willis Overland building, that was the case, that creation of that local historic district bought time for that building to be transferred to a preservation-minded owner eventually.
Great, thank you, Stacia. So there's some examples of how PM works or has worked with some threatened historic resources, and just to touch very briefly so we can get to some questions. If you have a threatened historic resource at any time, and you're really not sure of where to go or what to do, now we have Chris's 15 questions, which is a fantastic resource to look through. Also on Preservation Massachusetts website, we have our new Action Center. And part of that is a document we've created, which is called Roadmap to HP Success. We always like to think positive and that it's going to be a success, but it helps by breaking down some of the steps and some of the, again, some questions you're going to need to ask yourself, but like, okay, I'm concerned, what do I do next? So that may be helpful to take a look at to just give you a sense. I like to think of it as like a 25,000 foot view. It's really not specific. It can change, things can shift, but it might be a good something to look at to give you a sense of, okay, we have a threatened historic resource in our community. What are the steps we're going to need to take? Between that and Chris's 15 questions, that's a lot of really good resource and a lot of really good guidance. And also we have another program at Preservation Massachusetts, something Chris did mention, which is our Most Endangered Historic Resources program. This program has been in place with Preservation Massachusetts since 1993. It is an advocacy, education, and PR program. Like MHC and like Chris said, Preservation Massachusetts does not have power to stop threatened historic buildings from being torn down, altered. So we don't have any sort of regulatory authority at all. So this is really just an advocacy and education and PR campaign that really, and I like to really emphasize this, that really is supposed to dovetail and support active local efforts that are happening. That, just like Chris said, threatened historic resources can't be saved by just one person or one historic commission alone. There really has to be, you know, a good group, grassroots organization and advocacy efforts behind it. This is where we found the Most Endangered program is most effective, when there's already a group of working local, effort already underway, and that Preservation Massachusetts can elevate that to the state level and lend our support. So unfortunately, it's not the white knight in shining armor that's going to come in and save it, but something that we have found is very useful to, as Stacia said, help sway and help shift some public opinion, and sometimes get the word out. A lot of resources can be threatened, and people don't really know about that, or don't know of the deep significance of certain historic resources. So this program is biennial. It happens every other year. We are currently in a Most Endangered year, as we said. Now, as I say, Most Endangered year, it certainly is very fitting. We're now accepting nominations to this program. The deadline has been changed since we first announced it earlier this year. It's now going to be June 19th. The nomination form is available on our website. The link is right on the screen. And also new this year, we have a very handy how-to guide, how to fill out a Most Endangered nomination form. So we know sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming when you're looking at this document. What do they mean by historic resource? What do they mean by future plans? So we've tried to create a document that kind of gives you some insight into helping create and put forth the best nomination you can for a historic resource that you feel is threatened and endangered within your community. And shout out to our great program assistant, Nick Moore, for putting that together. Another thing on my list of things I've wanted to see done for years. So, so the Most Endangered Historic Resources Program is currently underway. So this list will be announced probably later on in the summer. And one thing to think about is that this program necessarily isn't one size fits all. You could have a threatened building or resource in your community that doesn't necessarily work quite well, or doesn't necessarily, the Most Endangered program wouldn't necessarily be a really good fit for it. But please know that Preservation Massachusetts, we are a resource. We are more than just this one program for threatened historic resources. You can send a general email to our office, contact staff directly, contact Jeff and Stacia directly. But even though this program is biennial, we work with threatened resources on a weekly, if not daily basis. So just something to think about. And as I said, one size doesn't fit all. And just to kind of go down the list of some of our past Most Endangered, just to give you a sense of where our organization works with them. Each resource that we list to the Most Endangered program, their outcomes are going to be different. Sometimes it's trying to stop an outright demolition. Other times it's trying to find a more preservation-minded buyer. Other times it's trying to get more community support or funding. So how Preservation Massachusetts works with the local nominator is going to be different for every single resource. But some examples of resources that have been listed in 2018, we listed a sea captain's house in South Dennis called The Columns. Shortly after listing it, Preservation Massachusetts Circuit Rider Jeff was talking with the owner, who was in a little bit over his head with trying to rehab this house, didn't really know what to do with it. So he actually put the owner and reached out to a preservation consultant who had worked with a preservation developer. Long story short, there was this property was actually purchased by a developer who has a history of successful historic preservation rehabs, and he's currently working on his plans for this property right now. So we consider that something that's progressing at this point in a positive way. Fenway Park in Boston was listed I believe it was listed in 1993. I'd have to go back. There is an archive on our website, but Fenway Park was listed way back in the 90s, before we broke the curse, and when ownership was seriously considering moving the park out of the Kenmore Square area. There was a local group called Save Fenway Park that partnered with the Boston Preservation Alliance to raise awareness and fight to keep Fenway Park in Boston. And as we all know how that turned out, the current ownership committed back in 2005 to remain in Boston. So that was considered a win, and we're then historic Massachusetts was supportive of Save Fenway Park and the Boston Preservation Alliance. Some things that we may have the best intentions for, even with lots of local effort and support and hard work and dedication and lots of passion, things don't go the way that we hope. Two churches, not even a half a mile apart in Worcester, were listed in 2016, Notre Dame and Our Lady of Mount Carmel. Both churches, unfortunately, were demolished. Notre Dame in beginning, I believe, Stacia, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe they both were demolished. Notre Dame, I believe, went down in 2018, and Our Lady of Mount Carmel began last year in 2019. Notre Dame did not have a parish. It had been desanctified and had been vacant for a long time. Our Lady of Mount Carmel had an active parish that was moved, but both of these magnificent churches in Worcester did end up being demolished. So we have successes, we have losses, and then we have things that are just still kind of hanging out there as endangered. The Thomas Samhain House in Natick is a historic house that's on a piece of property that's owned by Mass Audubon, and there's really no one's really sure what to do with this historic house. And it was listed. There was some effort. It didn't really result in anything. And then a few years ago, some advocates once again tried to have something done with the Samhain House, but it's just kind of currently kind of sitting in limbo as of right now. So dealing with threatened historic resources, we always try to look for that silver lining, but it can be a very long process. Preservation takes a lot of time and a lot of patience. And sometimes you can see several waves of people and efforts to try to save a historic resources. I don't know why I didn't put it on here, Stacia, the Nishwag Inn in Petersham. It was listed in 2002, and it's the proverbial phoenix that keeps coming back from the ashes. We have thought it's going to be demolished, I don't know how many times, and there are still local advocates who keep coming up and saying, no, we can save this, no, we can save this. So, so I think even though it may seem like something's going to happen one way or another, trying to be as proactive as possible is really, and trying to be proactive and educate people and reach out and get your grassroots constituencies in line and educated, and reach out to organizations like Preservation Mass and MHC for support in your local efforts. That is just some helpful advice. So we do have a bunch of questions that have popped up, and we have a little bit over 10 minutes left. So I'm actually going to go back up, and so these questions open to anybody. Jeff, Chris, Jeff, Stacia, Jim, feel free to chime in. And again, if we don't get to your question, I am going to save the chat log, figured out how to do that finally, so we can go back and get you the answer to your question. So next question would be, what policy or rule can we include in our local historic district guidelines to prevent facadectomies? Chris, do you have any suggestions for that or examples, Jeff, Stacia?
Yeah, I'll just do this one quickly, I think. So facadectomy, meaning basically they're leaving the front of the building, the facade itself, but everything behind the facade gets demolished and new construction gets put in behind that old facade. So this destroys a huge amount of historic character here, and can be really I mean, it's just leaving the area really hollowed out when you're just having a facade there. I think one of the first question is, if by having a facadectomy in a local historic district, it may not actually be visible from the public way. So if the facade as what's visible from the public way, what is the only part that's regulated by the local historic district ordinance, could mean that the facadectomy might be allowed, even though certainly not appropriate to do. So that's one aspect of this to consider, is that you may not even have any review authority if it's not visible from the public way. If it is the kind of alteration that still would be visible from the public way, then certainly have something in your guidelines about the. I mean, it's not necessarily a policy or rule. It's just another piece of your guidelines in terms of talking about Secretary of the Interior, going right from the Secretary of the Interior standards about saving character defining features of the building. So anyway, I can work with, if you wanted to email me later, I could give you some examples and talk more about how design guidelines work. I'm happy to do that. So I don't want to take up too much time just with that one. Happy to talk later.
Great, thank you, Chris. I can forward that along. Next question. What is a good counter to those who oppose either creation of a new historic district or the expansion of one because they believe being subject to historic district commission regulation imposes on individual property rights?
I love these questions. I love these discussions. And I think as preservationists, we should all love these discussions. I think an important thing to ask yourself when you're walking out of the coffee shop and somebody comes up to you and says, that local historic district you're proposing, that's going to impose on my individual property rights. And if you go into that conversation with your coffee in your hand that you're really looking forward to having, expecting to convince them in the next 5 minutes that you're right and they're wrong, good luck with that. So I would say try to think about your attitude before you even get to that, before those things come up, and just recognize I'm probably not going to be able to convince this person that quickly. So what could I do in the meantime so that there's an actual conversation taking place?
Chris, this is Diana Warren. I'm the one that posed that question. Chris?
Yeah, I can keep. I'm going to keep going with it though.
Okay, and actually, it's the Board of Selectmen.
Okay.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, go ahead. Sorry, Chris.
Yeah. So one thing.
I apologize, Chris. I think I just accidentally muted you. Hang on. I don't know where Chris went.
Okay, I got it.
Okay, sorry.
I got it, Erin. Thanks. All right. So one of the important things to think about here is the distinction between property rights and property interests. And is it, when somebody's saying this, are they talking about their property rights, which really comes down to a constitutional issue? Or are they talking about property interests, meaning I want to be able to do whatever I want with my property, but it doesn't have anything to do with the Constitution. I just want to be able to do whatever I want with my property. So those are two very, very different ways to have that conversation. And I actually do have some talking points that I put together. They're not really written up, but maybe we could have a session on this at some point in the future. But these are talking points that I use when I get these calls on how I talk to people when they've called me, because I've certainly had plenty of these calls myself. So one of the things I do is just when they say this is going to be imposed on my individual property rights, I might actually come back and say there are many people that feel the same way you do. There are many people that do not support the concept of a local historic district. Why do you not support having a local historic district? Give them that opening. Sort of take that opportunity, because you're not going to convince them in the next 5 minutes holding your cup of coffee that they should support a local historic district. Give them that voice for the next 5 minutes to hear what they have to say.
Thank you very much, Chris.
I'll just finish up with one more thing. I had this conversation with one person a while back, and we finished up. I went through a bunch of my questions, and we had a good conversation. And in the end, she was just talking about how local historic district wasn't going to benefit her at all. And we talked more, and I did say that I said I think maybe you're right. Maybe it won't benefit you at all. I mean, if you're not at all concerned about the community character of your neighborhood, yeah, maybe a local historic district won't benefit you at all. But then she got a little defensive. She's like, no, I care about the community character of my neighborhood. I do care about the community character of my neighborhood. And then then by the end, she recognized that, well, I may be opposed to a local historic district, but okay, if a local historic district was established, I can see that I would have a benefit from it as well. And I just left it at that. I'm not sure what happened with that local historic district or how her opinions went on from there.
Thanks, Chris. That's great, and that's a great idea. I know sometimes we as preservationists, and myself, I'm horrible at this. We do tend to talk a lot of preservation speak. There's lots of acronyms, lots of words we're throwing around that we just assume people understand. That we assume people know what a historic district is. We assume they know that what the benefits are and that sort of thing. But talking, even though people may live in a community with a lot of historic resources, they may not understand, preservation and the words they're throwing around and what it's really going to mean. So I think maybe having a future conversation about how to talk about preservation to people who are not, not preservationists, they're not on the commission, they're not familiar with a lot of our terms, and really how to talk to people about preservation in their community and the different things like historic districts and National Register, and how to talk to them about it. That might be something very beneficial that local advocates could really use, because I think there's especially with being very reactive, how we sometimes come across really trying to figure out and try to talk to as many people as possible, and make sure that everybody understands, and we're not just speaking preservation speak and nobody really understands it and they just really don't want to hear about it. So that's a really good suggestion for a future conversation. So thank you very much. That was a great question. Okay, moving on. Let's see, we got that. The next question was about a historic commission trying to save a 1790 historic house that was scheduled to be demolished in August, but due to the coronavirus pandemic, is it possible to prolong the demo delay at least for another 4 months or so? I know Chris and Jeff did respond to this person, and I know Jeff, this is something that Jeff, as our circuit rider, has been made aware of, and I don't know if Chris has as well. So I'm not really sure if there's any sort of, if anybody would have any sense as to whether or not this could be, you could extend a demo delay due to the current state of the world right now. So since I'm really not sure, Chris, would you really have any sense of that from a regulatory standpoint? I'm really not sure if that would be up to local jurisdiction, so to speak.
So there has been emergency legislation passed that relates to all local boards, planning boards, ZBAs, Conservation Commission, and historical commissions, historic district commissions. And largely what's that's saying is that if an application has come in for, say, a certificate in a local historic district or demolition delay, the decision-making process can wait. There won't be like an automatic approval of a project just because the historical commission or district commission or planning board hasn't acted on it. In this case, I'm not so sure that this would be how that legislation would impact this, though. I suspect probably not. But I think this would probably be a question for your town council, who's probably very familiar with that recent legislation. I think because you're already in that demolition delay process, I don't think this would be impacted with that legislation. So, yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Chris. Since we are at 11 o'clock, I know we did have a few other questions that did come up, but so what we're going to do is I'm going to take the questions that did not get answered, and there were a couple. There was one about the role of MHC with 40B projects, and then another one about a single building historic district. So those will be passed on to, forwarded to the individuals. They'll be forwarded to all of us, and hopefully we'll be able to get back to you directly with the answer to your question. So sorry we ran out of time, but what a really great questions this week. Thank you very, very much. And again, if you're on this call and all of a sudden in like an hour, you think of another question, or in a couple of days, we encourage you to email both myself and or Chris. Both of our emails are up on the screen right now. So send us, and also send us some thoughts and suggestions for future conversations and educational offerings. I know this is something that we're really kind of just starting out with, but something that I know Preservation Massachusetts would like to see continue on. And if there's ways that we can do this to bring you more presentations and workshops, that sort of thing, you know, we're happy to work with, we're pleased to be working with MHC in this way. So, you know, your suggestions, because we're really doing this for you. So your suggestions and your thoughts are hugely important. So thank you so very much for attending once again. We're going to be doing this again next week. So that would be last day in April, which feels like the longest month, but the shortest month. So our last one is going to be on Wednesday, April 29th. Not our last one, excuse me. The last one for April will be on the 29th. More information will be emailed out and posted to Preservation Massachusetts website, social media, all of that. And this recording will be going up on YouTube and our website later on today. So once again, thank you so very much for attending. Thank you for all the great questions. We hope you found this helpful and educational. And stay safe, stay healthy, and we look forward to talking with you next week. So thank you all so very much.